Darwin lived at a time when no one knew what was inside a cell. So they just talked very cavalierly about evolution and stuff. Tell us what happened in science in the last 100 years that leads you to write your first book, Darwin's Black Box, and that leads Stephen Meyer to write Signature in the Cell. What do we know that we didn't know when Darwin was hanging out?
Well, when Darwin first started, the cell was thought to be a piece of jelly, protoplasm. Some buddies of Darwin's got some mud from an exploring ship and looked at it under a microscope and thought they saw cells there, and so therefore thought cells would bubble up spontaneously from the ocean depths. So that's just to give you an example of how primitive science was compared to today. But in the 100 years or so, we've discovered that there are molecules in the cell. People back then didn't even know molecules were real.
How embarrassing. We all know that.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah.
Okay.
And as more and more of the cell was studied, DNA was discovered. It turned out that DNA carried information that
So now we're talking about Crick and Watson?
Yes.
Okay,
in
so
the 50s.
fairly recently. Okay,
That's right.
but we didn't, I mean, yeah, it's hard to believe, like, we literally didn't know about DNA until very recently. I mean, there are many people in this room who were around before we discovered DNA. So it's like 10 minutes ago, and obviously Darwin didn't have the beginning of a clue of any of these things.
That's right. Yeah, he figured the basis of life was simple, jelly, protoplasm, and, well, maybe that could shape itself or stretch itself into pretty much anything.
Isn't it weird, like, if you read science fiction from maybe the 20s or something like that, they talk about protoplasm, and they talk about that stuff, like it was a thing, and now we know, like, there was no such thing, but it kind of was in vogue. Okay, so we have to ask the question. Darwin was a well-meaning scientist. He and Alfred Russel Wallace come up with this concept of natural selection or whatever, and in many ways, of course, it is very plausible. And in that day, it was eminently plausible because they didn't know that the universe was 13.8 billion years old. They thought it was infinitely old and there was an infinite amount of time. So now that we know what we know, what is it that you think makes it so difficult for other scientists to at least say, Houston, we have a problem, evolution has problems?
Well, as you know, science and religion have a history. And back in the day before Darwin, every educated person thought life was designed. And it was obvious because, you know, birds have wings and fish have gills and so on, all these things that fit them to their environment. And Darwin proposed this non-intelligent explanation for life, and biology, which was then kind of struggling to become a professional science in its own right, loved it because now we don't have to ask, you know, the pastors and the ministers for permission to say something about life. We'll just figure it all out on our own. So there's a kind of a professional jealousy. People want biology to be able to be explained in the same way that physics and chemistry can be explained. So there's a history.
But I guess, I mean, even in my own stumbling research on a very popular level, I'm amazed at how there's more and more and more information that keeps coming out. I mean, your book, when I talked to you on my radio program this week, you know, the idea that you're writing about stuff that we've known for like 20 years or less. Yes. And that's what enabled you to write this book. Let's get to the thesis of the book. When you say Darwin devolves, and the subtitle is The New Science About DNA That Challenges Evolution, the new science about DNA. So what is new that even in 1995 we could not have known that you now know and put in the book?
Well, it turns out mutations, which are the fodder for evolution, are changes in molecules in DNA.
Yeah.
When you switch something in DNA, it changes the instructions, make it code for something else. And we did not have the technology back then to see what the changes were. most of the time people would see that there was a change in an organism and it did better. And they said, look, this mutant is doing better than it did before.
Okay.
Isn't Darwin's theory grand?
Okay, now before you give us the rest of that story, so just to be clear, I want to make sure everybody's tracking, right? So and there's some people here who know tons about this, but maybe some don't. But so the idea is that Darwin and the people, his champions throughout the decades said that, look, it makes sense that mutations happen. Okay. Now, I wonder if that's a great bumper sticker, right? Like, I would think that biochemists would you can use that. I'll just give that to you.
Thank you.
So mutations happen. And we know, that's inappropriate laughing, please. And we know that, we just know that mutations happen. So they said, okay, if mutations happen, given an infinite amount of time, which in those days they thought we had, because they didn't know about the Big Bang and so on and so forth, they said it only makes sense that a good mutation will help that creature to thrive, and another good mutation will help it thrive more. So the good mutations eventually will lead to better creatures, and that's the process of evolution over the eons. They believed that given enough time, mutations would create effectively us.
That's correct. And you have to remember they didn't know what a mutation was. And Darwin didn't talk about mutations, but rather about variation. And so,
when did mutations come into it?
in around the turn of the 20th century or
Okay.
so, people started to look at that. After Gregor Mendel and his pea garden in Austria started genetics. But they would say things like, well, if you were a deer and the weather turned colder and a baby deer was born with longer fur, why, that would be better. And maybe if it got colder still and the children of that, the offspring of that got even longer, that would be even better. So they were thinking in terms of improving body features.
I mean, I never use the phrase, but it's what we call survival of the fittest.
Yes.
Okay, so the ones that happened to be best adapted survived and thrived and mated and had more of the same, and this process goes on and on. Okay.
Exactly. But people never said, well, that's great, but how does that explain complex features when you have to put a few things together? And Darwin kind of treaded lightly around that and waved it off and says, we'll figure that out later when we understand more about biology. But that turns out to be the key critical question. How does complex changes, how do they come about?
Okay, so we're not going to have time tonight, but when you say complex changes, in other words, when you're talking about the length of hair, or on the cover of your book you have Darwin's famous finches, right? So if you got a finch, some finches have bigger beaks, some have more narrow beaks, whatever. Not exactly complicated, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the hair of the deer. It's like simple. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about how does a whale come into being? And the suggestion, of course, is what? That some mammals eventually are wandering in the water and that, suddenly, Shazam, it's a whale. Yeah. I mean, David Berlinski brilliantly mocks this stuff in his writings because it is very funny when you start talking about, okay, so what's necessary for a land mammal to become a whale, who's also a mammal? What's necessary? And the number of things, like it's so complex that it becomes a kind of madness. So if you say that to a strict Darwinist, what do they say?
They say you're a creationist.
So name calling is the order of the day. Right?
Name calling and condescension, and at best, what you'll get is what's known in the trade as a just so story, where people give kind of a semi-plausible account of perhaps one feature of an organism developing. And it sounds, shaky, but then they say, well, clearly that could have happened. That could have happened. So therefore, there's no reason you can't think that happened and this happened, and we don't get to the point where they all become integrated into one system.
Okay, so the big news that enables you to write this devastating book is that it's no longer speculation. We now can look at the actual mutations and determine whether they are helping the organism and how. And based on your research,
Well, it turns out that they do help them. There's lots of mutations that help. But the bottom line is that overwhelmingly, the mutations are ones that break things that were already there. They take genes that are working in some organisms and figuratively snap them and throw them away, and that helps in some circumstances. And people might wonder, how can breaking something help? Well, if you think of your car, suppose your life depended on you getting better gas mileage for your car. What's a quick and easy way to get better gas mileage? Well, of course, you can throw things away. You can take off weight. You can take the doors and throw them away. Take the hood and throw it away. Of course, those are useful in some circumstances. But if right now your life depended on your car getting better gas mileage, the way to go is to throw those out. The cell does that too.
I just imagine a lot of people are thinking, well, so what? In other words, if mutation is the genetic code is broken here and that helps, why is that a problem for Darwinism?
Well, because it shows that Darwin's mechanism is actually powerfully devolutionary rather than evolutionary. It strongly tends to break things, throw them away, like the example I talked about, and that's not going to be something that constructs sophisticated molecular machinery such as we found in the cell.
Okay, so what you're saying is if I have a wolf and I want to breed dogs of various kinds, which basically has happened, right? You're saying that it's not a process of evolution, it's a process of devolution, meaning that you take the standard dog model of DNA and you break stuff off of it. So tell us about that.
Yeah, believe it or not, the complete DNA genome has been sequenced not only of wolves and not only of a particular dog, but dozens of breeds of dogs, purebred dogs with different features so that people can track down what's going on, what is causing them to have smaller stature or fuzzier fur or other features. And it turns out that to a very large extent, it's due to breaking genes that were already there. There's genes involved in fur that if you break them, makes it curlier. And genes involved in bone growth, if you break them, it'll be shorter. And there's developmental genes that help a snout develop, and if you break that, you get a truncated snout like in a bulldog. So we did show how Darwin's theory works by artificial selection, but it's working by breaking genes.
I feel like what you're saying, though, is that, in other words, what this is leading us to conclude is there are these models that exist. There's a dog, there's a cat, there are these different things, and you're saying that we can have microevolution and we can break the genes, and so we can make this kind of a cat or this kind of a dog, but we can never, because we're not adding genes or whatever, you can never breed a dog that will become a giraffe or a horse. You can never break out of the dog wheel rut, so to speak. Like it's always going to be some kind of dog.
That's correct. And more than that, you can think that, well, as this dog is selected for various things, say a French poodle or so on,
right,
those genes are thrown away and they're gone. They're not coming back. So the ability of the dog that has already been selected
right,
to adapt to a different environment becomes more and more restricted so that it becomes evolutionarily brittle.
What you just said, though, because I want this to be clear for the layman, and because scientists like us, we understand this stuff, but they don't know that I'm a scientist, but I know. So here's the issue. you're saying, I think, that Darwinists have been saying, for example, that there are no limits, that there are no boundaries, that a species is fluid, and that if I were to breed dogs long enough, I could get them as tiny as a housefly. But in reality, you're saying, no, the limits of dogness, and I just coined that word, are fixed. And the same thing with how big dogs can get. Because I think to those of us who don't know science, you'd sort of think like, look, why couldn't I breed a dog as big as this room? Why? But you're saying I can't.
Well, Clifford accepted.
Yes, right. And he's red, which is a whole other...
That's correct. Actually, I write in the book about a number of what I call luxuriantly evolving species, particularly on islands, such as the Galapagos, Darwin's finches. And it turns out there's a number of them. The finches have been on the Galapagos for millions of years, and they've formed about a dozen or 16 species. It's kind of uncertain. And a couple of, the next level up is genera, or genus, but no new families. And that's the next level up. And there are other rapidly evolving fish called cichlids in African lakes. And they have been there just 15,000 years. And it's known that because the Lake Victoria, evaporated 15,000 or so years ago. And these species are found nowhere else in the world. And there's about 1,000 of them, new species, and a number of new genera. No new families, though. And the level of biological family is like the cat family versus the dog family, okay? Lions and tigers and wolves and foxes and so on. And I make the case in the book that that is the limit of Darwinian unguided evolution. You can have new species and new genera, but you can't make a new family by unguided evolution.
As I've talked to Stephen Meyer about this, he seems to suggest that in Europe, not so much here, there are people at the cutting edge of this world in science who are open to talking about this, and that at the very highest level conferences, there isn't quite the fear that you find, let's say, in the faculty lounge at Lafayette or Lehigh, to pick something out of the, you know.
A few years ago, there was a kind of two dueling letters to the journal Nature. Nature is the most prominent science journal in the world. And the letters were by two groups of scientists, one saying that Darwin's theory is great, and the other one saying that we need to move beyond it. There are things that it doesn't account for. So, you know, this is in the premier science journal in the world, people saying that Darwin cannot cover everything. And what's interesting in the skeptical letter, the one that said that Darwin's theory doesn't really cover everything, that they said, we know that, you know, fear of intelligent design makes a lot of people want to circle the wagons and pretend that Darwin's theory covers everything. They talked about that explicitly. So a lot of this is due to fear of letting the great unwashed know the state of the biology.
And what is the big fear? I mean, is it fear that science is pointing to something like the God of the Bible, and that's just repulsive to some people? I mean, is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
What else is there to say?
My friend John